When Italian Jews immigrated to the Ottoman Empire during the 16th century, many of them wanted to switch to the Sephardic nusach, but some did not, and a dispute arose. The question was whether it was permitted to abandon a well-entrenched minhag, a communal custom, a question that was relevant then and very much relevant today. Our story tonight takes us back to the 16th century, 1500s, and to the city of Salonika. Salonika today is in the country of Greece, and I believe it's called by a different name today. But during the times that the Ottomans controlled this part of Greece, it was called Salonika, a very important city. Many Chachamim, many Rabbanim lived there, many Jews lived there. Now what happened was that in the aftermath of the expulsion from Spain in 1492, there were a lot of Spanish Jews, a lot of Portuguese Jews who made their way from Spain and Portugal to the Ottoman Empire. And that's where they started their new life. But what also happened during this time is that there are parts of southern Italy that are today part of Italy, and then they were actually controlled by the Spanish government, which meant that the policy, the anti-Semitic policies, and the Inquisition and those types of things were applicable in southern Spain. I'm talking about regions like Calabria, where the Esrogim come from, which is all the way at the heel of Italy. So it was controlled by Spain. And while it was not in 1492, but in the decades thereafter, the government said that the Jews need to leave. And this happened in other regions in southern Italy as well. Sicily was also controlled by the Spanish, and they too expelled their Jews. I believe that one was actually in the year 1492. And so these Jews as well make their way to Salonika and in the Ottoman Empire. And what happens is it's a shtickle kibbutz galius that's happening at this time of many different Jews from different backgrounds, different cultures, different minhagim who are coming together and living together. And that's going to raise a halachic question that we're going to see was brought to the attention of Reb Shmuel de Medina. Reb Shmuel de Medina is known as the Mahar Shtam. That's his acronym. A rabbi has to have an acronym. So his name is the Mahar Shtam, Reb Shmuel de Medina. He himself, his family came from Spain, and he had to leave. And he was a very prominent rabbi in the 1500s. And let's read how he presents the questions. He writes as follows: Kol echad shesider tfilasam kifi minhag avoseim haya al derech echad. There was a community that, as we're going to see, they're from Italy, the community from southern Italy, that they had a way of davening. However, one thing led to the next, and they came to the Ottoman Empire. Malchus Turgrima Yarum Haida. And their customs got messed up. What does it mean the customs got messed up? He explains, basically, everyone started davening in the Sephardic custom. Yan, why? They're the majority here. In other words, what happens? Usually, this is the way it works. Socially, when people come to a majority culture, the majority rubs off on them. So here you have a whole bunch of Italians, he didn't say that yet, but it's going to become clear in a moment, who immigrated and came to the Ottoman Empire. And the majority of Jews are davening the nusach that they davened in Spain and Portugal. We'll call it the Sephardi nusach. That's what they were davening. And so many of the Italians took on this nusach. He has another reason why they adopted it, and we'll see this is going to become a central theme of this tshuva. The Marshtam says another reason that the Italians switched over is because tfilasam tzacho mesuka. The Sephardi tefillah, the Sephardi nusach, which is his nusach, the Marshtam, it's a clear and zisa, sweet nusach. Okay, the majority of them left their past minig, and followed the custom of Svar. Which is the case here in our city, Salonika. And here he explains, Calabria, that's one region in southern Italy. Provenza, this I don't believe is in Italy, I believe this is Provence. Provence also expelled its Jews, mamish around this time. We always think about Spain and Portugal, 1492, 1497, but Provence expelled their Jews a few years after, in the early 1500s. And the regions, as we noted earlier, in southern Italy, Calabria, Provenza, Sicily, and Apulia. Apulia is another region down there at the heel of Italy. Okay, so they all came to Salonika, and Tafsu minig Sfard, they all took the minig of Sfard, and loy nishar kamat ki'im, loy nishar kamat, you have no one else left. Melting pot culture. Ki'im, he says something very interesting. The only survivors are Haki l'Gdoisha Ashkenaz, Ashkenazim. The Jews who emigrated, who came from France, who came from Germany. So they had Ashkenazi shul, and they actually didn't assimilate. Shaloi shinu min hagan. Okay, this is fascinating. Why is it fascinating? Because what do we know? There used to be a Nusach Italia. There still is, but there are very few people who daven with it. But there was once a time it was just as prominent as the other Nuschais. There are certain Nuschais that were, for whatever reason, survived. And here we're seeing how Ashkenaz in real time is surviving as a minig, which it came down to us to today, is because despite the fact that the Italians are giving up their Nusach when they came to the Ottoman Empire, there's something about Nusach Ashkenaz. And I'm not saying that I know why. There's something about Nusach Ashkenaz in the 1500s that Jews coming to Salonika, they're not comfortable giving up their Nusach Ashkenaz, and they keep it. And I'll show you another instance, another witness to this later on. Okay, so what's the problem? So far, so good. Here's the problem. Although it is true that the majority of Jews that came from Italy, they are very happy to change over the Nusach, you have some of them who say, no, we want to keep the tradition, we want to daven the way we were brought up in Italy. But the majority don't want to daven on Seder Tfilas Svart. Okay, why? They're used to it. And that's the question. The majority wants to know, did they make the right choice, that they gave up their Nusach Italia, and they started their Nusach, and they took on Nusach Svart. There's a protest, there's a few individuals that want to hold on to the Nusach Svart. What to do? This is the question that the Maharshtam, whose estimated dates are from 1506 to 1589, is asked in the city of Salonika. So the Maharshtam begins his tshuva with putting out a Gemara, that if you learn this Gemara, it would seem that maybe you're not allowed to change your Nusach HaTfilah. So let's see this Gemara. This is a very famous passage in Gemara. The Gemara in Psachim Daf Nud Amid Beis says as follows. First, a little bit of background. Today in Lebanon, there are two important cities that we're going to talk about now. That is Tzur and Sidon. These are two cities that are today part of Lebanon. Both of these cities are on the coast. In Sidon, as we're going to see, in Sidon, which I guess was the bigger city at the time, and during Talmudic times, there was a market every Friday. And so the people from Tzur, which is further south, would get on a boat and travel along the coast up to Sidon to be there by the Yom HaShuk, to be there at this market day. Now there's a lot of small villages around Tzur. One of them is Beishan, or Beishan. And the people from Beishan, what they would do is they'd get on their donkeys, their horses, whatever, drive into the big city in Tzur, jump on a boat, go up the coast, do your shopping, and then come back down. This was the Seder that was happening. And so many of the people in the villages around Tzur would do this. Says the Gemara in Psachim Daf Nun Amid Beis, however, that Bnei Beishan, or Beishan, the people of this place, no, their custom was the loy hava ozlin mitzur litzidoin b'ma'alei Shabbata. Ma'alei Shabbata is Friday. They would not go from Tzur to Tzidon on Friday. Zok Rashi, why? Yom HaShuk shel Tzidon be'erev Shabbos. Because what's going on Friday here? It's the market day. V'hei machmirim ha'atzman. They took it on as a chumrah. Shaloi li'bato mitzarchei Shabbos. This minig was there to make sure that they occupy themselves with preparing for Shabbos. We know that preparing for Shabbos takes time, and there's a lot of things that we need to do, and you could do it well, you could do it not so well. And so they made a takana in their community, and it doesn't sound like it came from the rabbis. Generally speaking, when we talk about minhagim, it came from the people. The people on their own said, you know something, we want to be really careful in the midst of preparing for Shabbos, so we don't want to waste our day traveling up to Tzidon, and this is what they took on. Now, what happens is, the Gemara continues and says that the older generation passed out, passed away, the next generation was born, and Asu B'nayu Kamei de Rabbi Yochanan. Their children came to Rabbi Yochanan. I assume Rabbi Yochanan lived in Eretz Yisrael, so they came down, and they had a conversation with him. Amrullah, they said, Rabbi Yochanan's the first generation Amoira. They said, Avasin Efshar Lahu, our parents were able to keep this chumrah. They liked it. They liked the idea of spending many hours on Friday preparing for Shabbos, or they didn't need the marketplace or whatever it is. Anan, us, lo yafshalan, it's impossible for us. We need to get to this marketplace in Sidon on Friday. Basically, we want to drop the minig of our ancestors, of our community. Amar Lahu, Rabbi Yochanan told them, Kvar kiblu aveiseichem aleihem. Your parents already accepted it for you, in your behalf. Your parents already accepted it. In other words, the minig is binding, and he quoted the pasuk Shenamar Shma b'ni Musar Avicha, that the child should listen to the ethical teachings of his father, Val titash Torahs imecha, and do not give up the teachings of the mother. What's this pasuk teaching us? The regular Torah mitzvahs we know that we need to keep. Dinim derabanan, we already know that we need to keep. We have many psukim for that. So what's this pasuk in Mishlei teaching us? The chiddush of this pasuk in Mishlei, as understood by Rabbi Yochanan, is the things that aren't absolute chiyuvim, the things that are minhagim, taken on by a family, a community, or whatever it is, that these need to stick around. Now, if you follow the logic of this argument, the Maharsh Tam suggests in the opening of his tshuva, it would seem that everyone has to stick with their minig. So the people coming from Calabria, moving to Salonika, it would be wrong for them to change the nusach of their davening if you follow the logic of this Gemara. However, the reality is that the Maharsh Tam says that this is incorrect. And he says that they're absolutely allowed to change his minig. Why? What about this Gemara? And here, the Maharsh Tam lays out a major principle, and this is why this tshuva is actually a seminal tshuva. It's a very important tshuva, because he draws a very, very important line. Just like last week we spoke about the Ma'arik, who fashioned a very important line when it came to the mitzvah of kibbud av v'ein. He draws a very important line here about which minhagim we need to retain and which lav dafka we need to retain, not necessarily that we need to retain. What does he say? So let's read what the Maharsh Tam, Reb Shmuel de Medina, says inside. Tshuva, the answer is, nired af agav sheyesh inyan shadav or hagun v'nired tov leches ha'adam b'mineg avosav, though there are some things where it's a good thing, and it looks like a good thing to hold on to your menhagim, and it makes sense to say that at least approximately it fits under the commandment of Al Titash Teres Imecha. Nonetheless, in our case, when it comes to davening, it's a good idea to drop your previous nusach, the nusach Italia, lecha is beseder minig Sfard, and to jump on to the Sfard train. Why? What's my logic? When do we say that a person shouldn't change the minig? When did Rabbi Yochanan say this? When we're dealing with a matter that has a nidnud iser, a touch of iser. As he goes on, it's going to become clear what is he saying. He's arguing like this. Now we have two different minhagim. Let's take, lamashal, the minig of kitnius on Pesach. And let's take another Yom Tov, the minig to dress up on Purim, or to eat milchiks on Shavuos. Okay. Why do we refrain from eating kitnius on Pesach? It's a minig. Why do we refrain? Why did the Ashkenazim start this minig? Because they were concerned that should you eat kitnius, you're going to come to eat chametz on Pesach. Okay, so that's called a minig that's there to protect against doing an aver. In other words, there's a real din that you're not allowed to eat chametz on Pesach. Whatever may be a din, it could be deraisa or derabana. So then what happens is that a community says, in order to protect ourselves and we don't violate that din, no matter what it is, we're going to make a minig. So that's a good example. Kitnius is a great example for that type of thing. Or B'nai Beishan is another example. There's a chiyuv to prepare for Shabbos. It's part of the din of kavod Shabbos. It's a real chiyuv. So we want to make sure that we don't do a bad job in executing that chiyuv, and so therefore, in order to protect that, we're not going to go. So that's called a minig, sheyesh by mishum nidnud iser. What you're doing is, it's a minig to protect that you keep Shulchan Aruch properly. Then you have, in order to add simcha to Purim, so you dressed up. Or for various reasons that it's not entirely clear, or maybe it is clear, it's not our topic tonight, we eat milchiks on Shavuos. Or many other, go back to a previous year, not to make Kiddush on 6 and 7. Is that about protecting from any isser, deraisa derabana? Not at all. What's that minig? That minig is because of the tradition of that we don't like the influence of Mars. Okay, beseder. So that's not about protecting for isser. And if you go through the minhagim, you'll see many of them fit under the first category, many of them fit under the second category. His chiddush is, his line drawing is that the whole thing of Al Titash Teres Imecha is when it's minhagim that are there to protect us from violating a real din. Those things you You have to really keep those. And yes, as Rabbi Yochanan told the community there, it's too difficult for you. It doesn't matter. There's something you need to hold on to. However, other types of minhagim, he feels that aggressive approach does not need to be there. Let's continue reading inside. Indeed, if you go to Maseches Pesachim, which is the context of the Gemara that we were quoting before, it comes up in a Gemara. The name of this parak in Pesachim is called Makom Shanagu. And you have Mishnah after Mishnah after Mishnah saying that in a place where there's a custom to not do so-and-so, so if you visit that place, you need to keep the Chumrah. What are all these minhagim? So, what's one of the examples? Not working out of Pesach. Not working after Chatzos out of Pesach. That's obligatory. That's a din d'Rabbanan. You're not allowed to work Chatzos on Erev Pesach after midday. What about in the morning? So there were some people who had a chumrah not to work even in the morning. Why? So Rashi tells you, so that they don't get distracted, that they're doing a good job in burning the chametz on time, that they're making sure they're preparing their matzah, that they're bringing the carbon Pesach. So in other words, this minhag of not working Pesach in the morning, even 8 o'clock in the morning, where did it stem from? It stemmed from protecting against the Surim. And likewise, if you go through the Mishnayos over there, all of them, or at least most of them, are very similar, where the minhag in this particular place was there to protect a certain type of din. And then he brings the example of Beishan. So, but he says, in our case, when it comes to davening, so what is davening? I daven in this nusach, that nusach. Does your minhag of which nusach that you daven in have anything to do about protecting that you shouldn't violate some sort of other din, the Raisa or the Rabbana? No. And so therefore, as odd as it may sound, it actually fits into the category of dressing up on Purim, of the milchiks on Shavuos, and of the Kiddush between 6 and 7. And so therefore he says, it's like a tzad iser klav ikr. There's no issue over there about protecting from an iser. V'loy archakas avera, hapshita. Here, al titash doesn't apply. Now, would he say it doesn't apply at all? Maybe you'd say it applies a little, whatever, but the din, the absolute din of al titash teres imecha, where Pasha gets in the way, and Rabbi Yochanan says, by the way, you cannot change. And think about it. It's a matter of halacha. Halacha says you can't change the minhag. So that, he says, is only for things that are there to protect against real dinim. And then he goes on, you always want to have a makar in the Rishonim when you're saying something. And so he goes on to bring evidence from the Ran. Because the Ran of Maseches Pesachim, if you read it carefully, he's going to talk about minhagim, and let's see the way he talks about it. So the Ran says as follows, so we learn when it comes to minhagim, shakol minig iser shu bir achas, if there is a prohibition to do a certain act in a certain city, so kol she'ein minig betal, as long as it's not a mistaken minig. You have the concept of a minig that's pushing a bad idea. So assuming that it's not that, and they did, why do they have this minig? In order to protect that we don't end up doing an aveira or missing out on a mitzvah, then kol bnei chayavim by minadin and al titash teres imecha. So when did he invoke al titash teres imecha? He invoked it when he's talking about making a siag. A siag is that gate where we want to protect ourselves from violating an actual Isra. And so therefore the Maharshtam feels that he has evidence from this in the Rishonim, and so therefore he makes this big argument, this very important point. Now, are there those who disagree with this? Yes. There are those who disagree with this. We're not going to cover all of the shittas on this question, but this is definitely a very prominent voice and a very important voice. And as we move along, we'll see what the Alter Rebbe has to say about this position. However, before we get there, let's note that the Maharshtam actually goes further. He says, not only is it okay to change, I actually recommend that you change. Now, why? Why recommend? And here the Maharshtam does something really interesting, and he basically speaks out against elements of Nusach Ashkenaz, where he has a problem with it. And let's see how he develops this point. So he says as follows. In the first paragraph of 7, what you're looking at, it's actually, the wording here is actually a little difficult, because he says there aren't really real differences between Ashkenaz and Sfard. There aren't. You want to know where the differences are? The main difference between Ashkenaz and Sfard is in our piyutim. You have to remember, in the 1500s, piyutim play a much more prominent role in davening, definitely in Nusach Ashkenaz, than they do today, because as a generation, some have moved on. Some piyutim fell out by the wayside. So, but in the 1500s, a lot of piyutim. And so therefore, what's he saying? He's saying the main difference is piyutim. Now, what does that mean? we all know that there are many other differences in whether you say Hoidu before Baruch Shamar, or you say Baruch Shamar before Hoidu, whether you say V'yitn L'cha and Ma'ariv Motzei Shabbos, there's a whole bunch of things. So what's he saying? So it seems what he means is that all of those things don't really matter. In other words, there is, when we say the Chazal or Masakin and Nusach HaTfilah, most of the Rishonim understand that to mean about the beginning of the bracha has to be a certain way, the end of the bracha has to be a certain way, you need to cover a certain theme. What else? Who cares? Whatever you want. It seems that that's what the Maharshtam is saying, that I'm not even going to talk about these types of differences if Hoidu is before Baruch Shamar or after Baruch Shamar, because both are valid. I don't consider that a real difference. What's the real difference between these two minhagim is what I want to say, what I want to talk about piyutim. This is what he says. And then look at the second paragraph of 7. Look what he says. Better to lose the piyutim than to have them. Especially in our day, no one knows what they mean. See Even Ezra's commentary in his commentary to Koheles, and see what he says over there, which we'll see in a second. So what's his point here? His point is going to be that, by the way, in a regular Tuesday, Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv, no issue. It's all the same. Where's his issue going to be? Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, Shabbos Zachar, Parshas Shkalim, Shabbos Chanukah, all those special days throughout the calendar when in Nusach Ashkenaz there are piyutim, and a lot of piyutim that were said both in Birchas Krishma and in Shemona Esrei, and those are the times where he's going to say that Nusach Ashkenaz is problematic because of those piyutim. So now he told us to look at the Even Ezra, so let's look at the Even Ezra. Even Ezra was known to be a sharp person, and he said what was on his mind, and he didn't hold back any punches. And this is what happened over here in the Even Ezra's commentary in Koheles. He writes as follows. It is forbidden to introduce liturgical poems into your davening if you don't know what they mean. And then he continues and says, I want to tell you like this. You have in the piyutim Rabbi Elazar HaKoler arba dvarim kashim, four major problems. So a note on Rabbi Elazar HaKoler. Most of the piyutim that are said by Ashkenaz in all the days that I noted before, including us and Chabad, still on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Tal, and Geshem, most of the material, not all, comes from Rabbi Elazar HaKoler, or Kinnis on Tisha B'Av. Rabbi Elazar HaKoler, there's a Tosfos in Chagiga that says he's a Tana. There's a Tosfos in Chagiga that says that he's actually Rabbi Elazar bar Reb Shimon Bar Yochai's son. So if so, then he's a Tana. Okay, when the Rosh quotes this, the Rosh says that Yesh Oimrim that he's a Tana. So in other words, that it's not said in a definitive way. There's a Yavitz and a Chidah that talk about the fact that maybe it's Kabbalistically, that he had the nitzvahs of the Neshama, Rabbi Elazar Shimon. The issue there is basically, where do you date him? Do you date him at the times of the Tanoim? Because others want to suggest that you have to date him a little later, and so that works out with what the Chidah and the Yavitz were saying that has to do with Shoyrish Nishmase. Anyway, most of the materials, questions, we'll do the questions at the end. Most of the material that we have in Shemona Esrei, when you open up on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, we're saying material is coming from Rabbi Elazar HaKoler. So the Even Ezra says, I don't like it. 4 problems. Number 1, Kiroiv piyutav chidais u'mishalim. Most of this is their metaphor. These are enigmatic. These are hard to decipher what these mean. In fact, there are some people, you don't even have to be a professional. You could look at a piyut right away and if you understand what it means, if then you can know it's not by Rabbi Elazar HaKoler. There is that basic test. And says Even Ezra, what's his problem with that? Let's go back to the Tanakh. Let's look at the tefillahs in Tanakh. Shlomo HaMelech has a tefillah in Sefer Malachim when they inaugurated the Beis HaMikdash, a beautiful tefillah. Read it. We could all understand every single word. You just need to have a basic understanding. In fact, we say it every day in davening. That passage in davening comes from Shlomo HaMelech. It's very beautiful, very easily understood. So he wants to know, why do we not learn from Shlomo HaMelech, who makes the tefillah understandable? Then he goes on and says, the same thing is, all the davening that you go back, that we attribute to Anshe Knesset Hagdolah and Chazal, All of these davenings are simple, plain, and understandable. And so therefore, problem number one with Rebbe Lazar HaKoller is why he made them so enigmatic and so difficult to understand. Okay, so this objection was answered much later by the Shar Ephraim. Shar Ephraim said, there's a famous medrash about why Torah Sheba'al Peh wasn't written. It's a famous shaila. If the Eibusher anyway is giving Torah Sheba'al Peh to Moshe Rabbeinu, why not write it down? At least the material that he verbally said, put it in the book. So there's many different answers to this question. The Medrash's answer to this question is that had it been written down, then it would have been stolen by other nations and other cultures, as they did to the Torah Shebiksav. In other words, it would have been part of what they stole. And so therefore, it couldn't have been written down, and so it wasn't part of the Geneva. And this way, our culture and our Judaism and their other religion remains distinct. This is what the Medrash Tanchuma says. In fact, that's why there's the Smag, when he speaks about this, or Moshe Mekutzi, he mentions and says, and so therefore, after the Geneva happened, so then we were, that's when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote the Mishnah. That's what he says. He actually tries to fit it into the dates. Okay, but the bottom line is, comes to Shar Ephraim, and he says, maybe that's the same reason that the Rebbe Lazar HaKoller wrote his enigmatic poetry. Because had it been easy to understand, then they would have taken it, and then there would be no daylight between us and them. Okay, fine. That's number one. Number two, says Even Ezra, number two, V'adavar Hasheni, Shepiyutov Mu'uravim B'Lashon Talmud. The Lazar HaKoller's piyutim borrows a lot of language from the Gemara, he's saying, from the Aramish. And he goes on to say, here you see, I guess he doesn't assume that he's a Tana if he's writing B'Lashon Talmud. Okay, Even Ezra had his own opinion. He didn't have to be bound by Tosfos. It's only a Yesh Omrim. Okay, so then he goes weiter and says, in the Talmud you have many languages that aren't Lashon HaKodesh. So why do we want to use non-Hebrew in our prayers? That's what he says. And then he brings a pasuk from Nehemiah, where Nehemiah is basically talking about the fact that Jews came up from Galus Bavel and they can't speak Hebrew. They can't speak Hebrew. They're talking Lashon Ashdodis, is what he says over there. And so that's a critique of the Jews then. So why would we want to do something like this? And then he writes, look at the tefillas from Chazal. The tefillas from Chazal are all divrei tzachus b'lashon hakodesh. So then that's what this should have been as well. Why should we daven b'lashon madai, ufaras, ve'edoim, ve'yishmal? This is his second objection. Then we come to his third objection. What's his third objection? V'adavar hashlishi, afilu hamiloi shein b'lashon hakodesh, yesh bahem toyois gedoylois. Then he gets into diktok. And he says that if you look at Rebbe Lazar HaKoller's poems, you find problems in terms of the diktuk in Hebrew. Even Ezra was very into diktuk. He wrote Svarim on diktuk. It's even in his commentary he gets into it. I left in one example. He writes, for example, that there's gender fluidity in Rebbe Lazar HaKoller's poetry. Sheyasem min ascharim nekeves vehefech hadavar. Changes from male to female and the opposite. What does he mean over here? So here's a dogma that's actually in our nusach. On Yom Kippur, in Musaf, the Magain means the piyut that is said in the very first bracha, right after Misoid Chachamim Unevoinim, the first thing that is said is Shoishan Emek Ayuma. So what do we mean when we say Shoishan Emek Ayuma? This is a piyut by Rebbe Lazar HaKoller. It starts with a shin because it spells out, it's an acrostic that spells out the word Shabbos Shabbosain. So that's why it starts with a shin. What's Shoishan Emek Ayuma? Shoishan is a rose. A rose is a yid. Emek is deep, stuck. That's a reference to Galus. The Shoishan is in Emek. The Yid is in Galus. Ayuma, what's Ayuma? Ayoim is in trepidation. The Jew who's in Galus is in trepidation. What's he trepidation? Because of the Yomim Naraim. So the Jew who's in Galus is in trepidation due to the Yomim Naraim. The Shoishan, Emek, Ayuma. These are the opening words of this piyut. Says Even Ezra, the word is Shoshana. When it ends with a hey, that's Lashon Nekeva. If you end it with a saf, Shoshanas, Yaakov, that also is Lashon Nekeva. But if you drop the hey or the samach, which he did, made it Shoshan. So if you drop that, then you can't say Ayuma. Ayuma is Lashon Nekeva. You need to say Ayon. So you have to say Shoshan Emek Ayon. He doesn't like the fact that it's Shoshan Emek. He thinks it should either be Shoshana Emek Ayuma or Shoshanas Emek Ayuma, or it should be Shoshan Emek Ayoim. So that's an example. He gives a whole bunch of other examples where he has diktuk problems with what is going on in Rebbe Lazar HaKoller's poetry. Then he has a metaphor. He doesn't like the metaphor because ayuma is the wrong type of adjective to use for a shoishan. He says a flower could be katufa, cut off. It could be ranana, fresh. It could be yavesha, dry. But to talk about a flower trembling, so you're using a metaphor, but now you're using an adjective that doesn't fit. Okay, that's a different type of taina, but he uses it under his third taina where he's not happy with the diktuk of these piyutim. V'hadavar haravi, the fourth problem that Even Ezra has with the piyutim, shekol piyutim maleim midrashes v'agodos. They're full of teachings that are not halachic teachings from Chazal, that are teachings from Medrash and Agada. What's the problem with that? V'chachamenu amru, and our teacher said, "Ein mikra yoytze midei pshutoi." That psukim, you got to go literal. Now, what does Even Ezra do with that? In Cain, ein roi lispalal darach pshat. If ein mikra yoytze midei pshutoi, if the main thing when it comes to mikra is pshat, so then the focus of davening should be pshat too. V'loy al derech sheyesh lo yisoid. Don't do me medrash in your davening. Why? Because a medrash may not be literal. It may have a secret meaning that no one knows. Oh, you al derech mashal. Maybe it has a metaphoric meaning. Oh, you kinyan shein halacha kamoitz. Or maybe the halacha is not like that position, that specific teaching in Agadata. Oh, she is parish le'inyanim rabbim. Or maybe it's ambiguous and it can mean 5 different things. If you remember, we had in previous classes, we spoke about the differences between Sfard and Ashkenaz and how they approach Agada. And here you see Even Ezra fitting into the Sephardi model, where there are these challenges, so to speak, when it comes to learning Medrash that he's talking about here, enough to say that it shouldn't play a role in your davening for him. And this is his fourth objection to including it. So now what happened here? Maharshtam brings all of this. And he's bringing all of this to say, that alone saved you during those days that you would sit in shul for a tal, for a geshen, a Shabbos Zachar, a Shabbos Chanukah, and you'd end up doing these piyutim, that alone, to avoid getting involved in Rebbe Lazar Kaller's piyutim, that alone is a good reason to transfer over from Nusach Ashkenaz to Nusach Sfard. I didn't say this before. The Nusach Sfard did not accept his piyutim. I can't say that not all of them, but definitely not the way Ashkenaz did. Generally, it's said that the community that developed in Ashkenaz, France, Germany, and Italy directly came from Eretz Yisrael, and they brought the piyutim Rebbe Lazar Kaller from Eretz Yisrael there. Whereas in Spain, they had much more influence from Bavel. Talmud Bavli, Rebbe Amram Goin Siddur, for example, was sent to Spain. And so therefore, Rebbe Lazar Kaller had less influence there, and that's the background to what's happening here. Maharshtam continues and then quotes the Rambam. There's a famous passage in Rambam in Hilchos Tefillah Nesiyas Kapayim, where the Rambam writes as follows. He writes the history of how Shemoneh Esrei came to be. So he says like this: when the Yidden were in Galus in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, they intermingled with the Persians and the Greeks and the other nations, and they had children in these foreign nations, and the children then, their language became discombobulated because they grew up with so many different languages going on. And so therefore, it reached a point that when the next generation would speak, they would not be able to ask in a pure Hebrew for all of their bakashas. And therefore, that was a chesaron, that was a disadvantage in the davening. And so therefore, Ezra, in the same time as Nehemiah that we spoke about before, Ezra's noticed this. Amdu v'tiknu lahem Shemoneh Esrei brachas al haseder. So he made the enactment, he documented, he wrote down the Shemoneh Esrei, the Anshe Knesset Hagoyla, Kadei sheyu aruches b'fi hakoil, so that everyone has it. What do you see here? You see in the Rambam, it seems to be important that everyone kind of be speaking in clear, pure Hebrew. Clear, pure Hebrew, because these are the language, this is the word that the Rambam is using. So Maharshtam invokes Even Ezra, he invokes the Rambam, and therefore he now concludes in number 10. And so what do we learn from these Gaonim? He actually here says, even though they're recent ones, right? It's funny because, we don't think of the Rambam and Even Ezra as recent ones, but for Maharshtam, he's like, even though they're recent ones, the main thing of davening, clarity, organized, accessibility, easy. In our tefillas that us Sephardim say, we only say stuff from the Chachamim. Yes, we do poetry. Yes, they have piyutim. The Sephardim also had piyutim. Yeah, but it's from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. That's from Shlomo Gabirol. That's from Avram ibn Ezra. These are all understandable and easy. The truth is, in our Kinus, for example, on Tisha B'Av, there's a few from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I can't say it's the easiest reading. I can't say that each word is intuitively understandable, but it definitely is easier than Rabbi Elazar HaKalir's Piyutim. Asher, mitam masha kasafti, therefore, nira be'ena, it seems to me, shaloi daisha ein leganois loisam ha'izvim, don't deride the ones who are leading the other customs and going to Sfard. Ela yesh l'shabeach lehem, they should be praised. So in other words, let's just summarize again. The permission to leave that we established long ago, permission. It's not a davar shel iser. You're not protecting an iser. This is not kitnius on Pesach. Go ahead if you want to. Okay, but that doesn't lead to encouragement. That just says you have permission. Why are we encouraging it? Because of the problematic piyutim that Ashkenaz has. This is what Marishdam says. And so therefore, so now come to this shul, come to this Italian shul, and the majority wants to daven Sfard, the language, the nusach, of Spain and Portugal, and you have a minority that wants to, no, we're Italians. The Sfardim are going to win because it's sach u'mesuda b'fi hakoil. This is good for a chacham and for a tipish. And then he adds the words, you're able to have kavana during chazaras hashatz. Whereas, if you're doing piyutim middle chazaras hashatz, what happens? If you follow other minhagim, first of all, the chazan doesn't know the piyutim. And the whole community, what are they doing? They're talking in shul. So this actually is not the first reference to this idea. Already the Tur, who was written earlier, the Tur was written in the 1300s by the son of the Rosh. He also writes about the problem about piyutim, and he says, at least the ones in Krishma, because there's again one for Yoitzer, there's one, there's a Zulas, there's 3 different piyutim that were said at that time, I think 3 or 4. He wants you to get rid of them, and he says, because people are talking during that. People are talking during davening because they don't know what's going on. It's a meaningless experience for them. And Marishdam is reflecting that same attitude here, writing a few hundred years later. And so therefore, he writes, "V'inke mitzvah litva is beseder tefillah sfard." Hold on to the sfard, ulahachzik toiva, ulamachzikim b'inir sfard, and we're going to praise them. V'heim ikar b'malchus hazeh marchos turgamon. He adds the words that they're the majority here, they're the main ones here, as if to add, that's another reason to go, is because at the end of the day, the majority of Jews here follow that minig, and that perhaps he doesn't give words to it. That would be another reason or another sniff to this idea. Okay. Did everyone agree with him at the time? So the truth is, we know that no, there were Rabbanim in Salonika, or at least in the Ottoman Empire, who were not happy with this psak. There's a sefer, if you learned Maseches Kedushin in Yeshiva, so you may remember that in the big Kovet Shiurim, there's toward the back, there was a sefer called Atzmas Yosef. Atzmas Yosef was written by a Jew who lived mamish during this time. He was a little younger. And he also wrote another sefer called Masa Melech. And in this Masa Melech, his name is Yosef ben Yitzchak Even Ezra. Okay, I don't know if he's related to the Even Ezra, if he's not. But he was a Talmud actually of the Marishdam. And he writes as follows. Ro'isi bebacharusi, when I was young, I saw a ksav, a note. Shulach Elai sent to me from another Rav, who? Reb Yosef Pormon Zal. Yosef Pormon, his estimated dates are 1515 as birth. Okay? And we know him. He doesn't have Sfarim, but he's mentioned by many of the people during that century, in the 16th century. Okay, so Yosef ben Yitzchak got a note from Yosef Pormon. And basically, Yosef Pormon's argument was, every person has to follow the minig of his father, basically disagreeing. Minig, the idea of Al Tita Shtar Zimecha applies also to davening. So here we have a contemporary Marishdam known as Rabbi Yosef Pormon who disagreed. Uvagdomas Sidur HaSiciliani, the Sicilians, it looks like I'm going to guess this means printed, that they printed a Siddur in the Ottoman Empire when they came, and they wrote a Hakdama, and Kosuv Ma'at Mizah, they also wrote, L'kaim and Hagam, hey, we are Sicilians, we need to keep our Italian minig. Remember, Marishtam's Tshuva told us that there were some Italians who were not happy with changing, and it could be they got their act together and actually printed a Siddur and then wrote, polemically in the beginning that their minig needs to be kept. Okay. Yosef Pormon wrote to me, Yosef Pormon told me that he got into a bitter fight and argument and dispute with my teacher, the Maharashtam. Why? Because my teacher, my Rebbe said that Sfard is the way to go, and Yosef Pormon disagreed and said everyone should keep their minig. I can't say anything. I'm not worth it. I'm not good enough, so to speak, to weigh in to this huge dispute, and therefore I'm going to leave it alone. Fine, so what did we learn? We learned that not everyone at the time agreed to Maharashtam, which goes to what I mentioned before. The Maharashtam drew a line here about minhagim. But if we want to start sitting here and applying it to other areas, and we really need to do a good job and make sure we learn all the different shittas, this is the Maharashtam shitta. Concludes Rabbi Yosef and Yitzchak Even Ezra, despite the fact that there were two opinions. One opinion said change, one opinion said don't change. Let's see what actually happened. In the majority of the cities, all of the nationalities, they changed over to Sephardim, except for Zulas HaAshkenazim. Here again, the Ashkenazim, they're holding their own. They are not changing over. They're determined to keep their minig. And so what's the justification? If Yosef Pormon said you're not allowed to, I think everyone's relying on Maharashtam. And what does he say? Hanach lehem Yisrael. In that situation, just leave it alone. If people want to change over, even though there's two voices, I'm happy to just say let people follow Maharashtam and let them change over, and that will be the end of the story. Okay, what's the next part? The next part is we need to ask ourselves a question. Around this time, the activity of the Arizal is happening, meaning toward the end of the same century, 1570s, 1560s, 1570s. And we know that the Arizal introduced major changes when it came to davening. So what would the Arizal and his students say about Maharashtam? Maharashtam very easily said, change. From Ashkenaz to Sfard, change. Would the Arizal and his Talmidim agree to that? So we go to Reb Chaim Vital, who writes in his Shara Kavanes. Shara Kavanes is one of the Sfarim Reb Chaim Vital. The Arizal did not write the Sfarim. His teachings, Reb Chaim Vital, his student, wrote many of the Sfarim. One of them is Shara Kavanes, and he writes as follows. It's a very interesting passage. There are many differences in the Sidurim between Sfard, Catalonia, the city of Barcelona, northeast Spain. It's its own region, Catalonia. They had their own minig. Uvein minig Ashkenaz. So the Arizal told me, what's going on over here? Why do we have such fragmentation in Jewish customs? You have in heaven 12 entry points. Keneged Yud Beis Shvatim, corresponding to the 12 tribes. The whole Shevet v'Shevet, every tribe, goes up, it ascends through that entry point, its unique entry point. If you look in Yecheskel chapter 48, you will see that there's a vision about the future in which the city of Yerushalayim has 3 doors on all 4 sides. 3 doors on all 4 sides equals 12. This is what Yecheskel is saying. So the Arizal is teaching that at least the deeper meaning of that nevuah is that's a Lamaila. It's a vision of what's happening in Lamaila. That there's 12 gates to get into the city of Yerushalayim, which is Yerushalayim Shalmaila. To get into the heavenly Yerushalayim, there's 12 different gates, one corresponding to each Shevet. There's no doubt, if all of our davening were the same, we wouldn't need the 12 entry points. And every shar also has its own road. So why do we have these unique roads and entry points? The reason we must have it is because the davening is different. Therefore, we need to have unique gates for each one. Because based on the idea of the root of the neshamis, of the souls for that shevet, so basically, what's the metaphysics of the difference in minhagim? It all starts with the fact that every shevet is not just that they came from Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. Every shevet has a certain type of a neshama. Obviously, every individual neshama is unique. But begadol, looking larger, you could look at 12 groupings and say there's 12 types of neshamas. Because they have unique neshamas, therefore they have a unique avodah. Part of that unique avodah is how they daven. And so therefore they have a path with their own entry point into toward God's ears. God's ears. Roy, what's the upshot of this? Roy, everyone has to hold on to the tradition given to them by their parents. People don't know which Shvatim they come from. So what's the best thing to do? The best thing, hold on to the tradition from your parents. Because your parents follow that minig. Maybe you, because you grew up in Catalonia, and your father's from Catalonia, so maybe you're the Shevet, your neshama needs the Nusach Catalonia for your prayer to be heard in heaven. Now you're going to throw it away? Your tefillah can't work. It's not going up if you don't have the right nusach. He continues and says, you need to know that's only about the different wording. In the Shemoneh Esrei, do you say Merid Atol in the summer? You don't say Merid Atol in the summer. Fine, so that's fine. You're going to have Hoidu before Baruch Shama or after. That's what I said, that there's 12 different pathways, etc. If anything is a clear Gemara, that's applicable the same for everyone. There is no difference. In other words, he's explaining, in some areas we're different. In some areas we're the same. Why? Because in some areas our souls are the same. In some areas our neshamas are different. And that breaks down the difference where the Rambam paskins in Hakdama to Mishnah Torah. This is what I think he's alluding to. The Rambam paskins in Hakdama to Mishnah Torah that any din that's clear in the Gemara, everyone has to follow. Chiluk of Menhagin could develop if it's not clear in the Gemara. Good. So what's clear in the Gemara, that's the common denominator in our souls. And the fragmentation that developed thereafter for something that's not clear in the Gemara, so Chiluk and Menhagin, that's what's unique about our souls. Then he goes and continues and says as follows. Now I'm going to tell you the nusach that I got from my teacher, the Arizal. Now I don't want to write a whole siddur, so what am I going to do? I'm going to sit here and write a whole siddur? No. In Venice, in the year 1524, a siddur was printed. It follows Nusach Sfard. I'm doing Nusach Sfard. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to take that siddur and I'm going to write Hagoys to that siddur. This is the beginnings of Nusach Arizal, which has a long history of the development of Nusach Arizal, Nusach Sfard. Just a quick note on that. When people started davening, changing over to this Nusach of Arizal, what it developed into is a combination of Ashkenaz and Sfard. That's what it developed into. Some mixture of both. It got the name Nusach Sfard, but we need to distinguish that from when we say Nusach Sfard, meaning in the tradition of the Arizal, versus Sfaradi, as in coming from Spain. So Sfaradi is, a Moroccan shul is Sfaradi, because they're immigrants from Spain. A Turkish shul is Sfaradi, right? Spanish, that's Sfaradi. Nusach Sfard, that's this. That's where what happened was that there were people who were davening in Nusach Ashkenaz, and they were incorporating the material that Chaim Vital, remember, Chaim Vital wrote the Agoys on a siddur, that's a Sfardi siddur. Now, if you're davening Nusach Ashkenaz and you want to bring that stuff in, so you're going to end up with a mix of both, which is ultimately what was called Nusach Sfard, and Adayam is called Nusach Sfard, and the Alter Rebbe siddur that's Nusach Arizal. But again, the topic and the development of that is beyond the scope of our discussion today. Now, let's come back to my question. My question was, we had a Maharshtam. Maharshtam seemed very liberal about changing your minhag from davening. And then he went further and said, and by the way, from Ashkenaz to Sfaradi, absolutely, it's a great mitzvah, it's a great thing to change. I asked the question, could the Arizal and his students agree with this? Well, we read this, it would seem no. Because what is the main thrust of what Reb Chaim Vital is saying? You got to stick with your minhag because that's very possible it's your shorish neshama. Now I know the Maharshtam it's a Kabbalistic argument, it's not a halachic argument, but fine. I'm not saying that Reb Chaim Vital seems to be disagreeing halachically, but at least from a standpoint of Papoil Mamish, due to the argument in Kabbalah, it seems to be here to go in a different direction. Now interestingly, this makes its way into halacha. Although Reb Chaim Vital is a Mekubal, writing Mitzad Kabbalah, his teaching from Shara Kavanis, which was very popular in the Magen Avram, the commentary to the Shulchan Aruch quotes it numerous times, and he summarizes this teaching. Look at number 13, the Magen Avram, Siman Samaches. Haminhagim shenagu b'shar she'at tefillah, ein l'shanes b'minig mekoymai. Don't change from minig mekoymai. He changed the word here. The Chaim Vital never said mekoymai. He always said avoisav. Here he changed it, the minig mekoymai. But l'chayra, because he's summarizing what Reb Chaim Vital is saying, l'chayra, we're going to just assume for the purpose of our class here that he means the same thing. Most people, the father and the place is synonymous, the same thing. Why? Why should you not change? Ki Yud Beis Sharim B'Shamayim, corresponding to Yud Beis Shvatim, and every shevet has its own shara and its own minig, except for things in the Gemara that's equal for all. This is Mama, and he writes hakavanis, meaning it comes from shara kavanis. So now Chaim Vital's teachings made it into the Magen Avraham, and guess what? The Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch quotes this. The Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch quotes it almost word for word from what the Magen Avraham says. So now we could say, could the Alter Rebbe agree with the Marashtam? So again, the Alter Rebbe here doesn't have a halachic discussion about when you could change minhagim or not. But the bottom line is Marashtam was telling you, go ahead, change, no issue. The Alter Rebbe here seems to be against change. You're not allowed to change your nusach because of the issue brought up by Reb Chaim Vital in the name of the Arizal that everyone, the nusach you have is probably your entry point to heaven. Afal Bikain, let me remind you about the shir last week. If you weren't here last week, you don't have to worry about it. Because I'll summarize very, very b'kitzur. Last week there was an issue where somewhere in Eastern Europe, without getting into where, there was a community of Hasidim that changed and started davening Nusach HaArizal, and the people made a macha over there. So the macha had two parts to it, and last week we only focused on one part. Last week's macha was kibbud avayim. Father told you have to daven a certain nusach, so mitzad the dinner kibbud avayim. You need to listen. Good. We exhausted that topic last week. We saw what the Alter Rebbe had to say. Hold on a second. Now there's a whole separate discussion. Forget kibbud avayim. Shinui haminig. Shinui haminig in and of itself. No parents involved here. The parents never spoke. Are you allowed to go ahead and change the minig? The minig, you grew up in Nusach Ashkenaz. Who gave you a right to change over the minig? So it looks like Rabbi Eliezer Katz, in his letter to the Alter Rebbe, although the bulk of it was on the issue of kibbud avayim, but it looks like he raises, because the Alter Rebbe, at the end, it looks like he already finished his letter, because he ended off with wishes for well-being, etc. It really felt like he's finished, and then he adds one more paragraph. And in this one paragraph, he says, no, it's actually, you're allowed to change the minig in davening. Based on what? Remember, the Alter Rebbe, in his own Shulchan Aruch, based on the Magen Avraham, based on Reb Chaim Vital, said that because of Sheresh Shama, don't change. So where is Alter Rebbe going to find a makar to say that you could change, and a makar that's going to work for Rabbi Eliezer Katz, who probably is not a makubal? So what argument is he going to give him? So let's look at number 15. This is the last paragraph of that letter from last week. I need to let you know, Shamin Adin, if you want to talk dinim with me, Ein shum iser b'shinui nuschais mepnei hamachloikas v'shinui haminig shebemishnu Gemara. There is no issue about changing a nusach because of machloikas. We'll come back to that in a second. And because of the issue of changing a minig, which is discussed in the Mishnah Gemara. Gemara and Mishnah talk about the fact you're not allowed to change minhagim. We saw that. Al titash taras u'mecha. It's the Gemara and Psachim. The Mishnah talks about not changing minhagim if you come to a place. You need to follow the majority. If no one's working Erev Pesach 8 o'clock in the morning, it's not nice for you to go ahead and be doing work. Marashtam didn't touch on that so much, but the Alter Rebbe seems to say that both of them are the same thing. But then, again, Marashtam's main point was about changing the minig, not about you're doing something different from what everyone else in the community is doing. Why? Why is this not a problem? There we go. So he quoted the Rashtam. Marashtam, the Alter Rebbe, seems to be supporting the Marashtam. There's no qualification over here. He thinks it's fine. Now, does he agree with every word in that tshuva? I don't think so. Clearly, the Alter Rebbe, would he have said all that whole Even Ezra with the 4 problems with Lazar HaKoler? I don't know. We don't know. That's the main thing that the Alter Rebbe is invoking from that tshuva is Shinui HaMinig. No, only for Isser. Only if you're protecting for a din. Only the Kitniyah style minhagim, of which there are many, and things like that. But not a minig that as it relates to davening. But remember, what happened last week? Despite the fact that he had a halachic argument that kibbud avayim was not an issue, Aval Bikein, he said, Laman HaShalom, we're going to have them changed. He says the same thing here. Aval Bikein, Laman HaShalom, Ani, as for the purpose of peace, I'll do this. Lifnai, v'lifni mishuras hadin, to go beyond the letter of the law, if you speak to the people and allow them to continue davening alone, so that they can daven b'mesinus, slowly, and ba'arichus. Because peace is important. Hashem yasim beinechem, and may you have amongst yourself ava v'achva shalom v'reus v'yavarech es Amoy Bashalom. So we end up with a very interesting place with the Alter Rebbe. Firstly, we shouldn't forget over here the message here about peace and how much sacrifice we need to have for the idea of peace, which is a very important message. But we end up with a very interesting place if you pause here with the Alter Rebbe. What's the Alter Rebbe say about changing Nusach HaTfilah? Well, I have two voices in my head. Voice number one, Shulchan Aruch, based on Chaim Vital. You're not allowed to change. That's one voice. Another voice, Marish Dam. No issue. You want to change your Nusach HaTfilah, you can go ahead and change your Nusach HaTfilah. Can you live with both of these at the same time? I'm just going to put it out there as two things. I'm not going to try to synthesize them yet. However, there's one more thing we need to do before we conclude. And that is that although Reb Chaim Vital said that, the next generation of Mekubalim already had a little bit more of a liberal perspective in this area. This brings us to the Mishnah Chassidim, Reb Emanuel Chai Riki, a very important Mekubal, whose dates are 1687 to 1743. So when he passes away, it's right around the time that the Alter Rebbe is born. And he is Mishnah Chassidim. He's very famous for holding the Tzimtzum as Kipshutoi, which is a fascinating subject. He's a very important Mekubal. Anyway, he quotes the same idea from Chaim Vital. You don't want to change your minhagim. And he talks about the fact that everyone has their own pathway to Shemayim. But then he says like this. Ve'im lo yoda im benafshoyu haminig shetafsu avosav. If you're uncertain or somehow uncomfortable about the minig that your parents have, and you feel it doesn't feel like it stims with my neshama, noyach lo sheis naheg b'minig hamuvchar shekibel Rav Chaim Vital kavanosav alav me'arizal. Then drop it. Drop your Nusach HaTfilah. If you feel that it's not working for your soul, that maybe it's not, then go with this concept that already existed in his day of davening, the version that's consistent with the kavanas that were given to Chaim Vital. Sherubayu, I'll say that Tfilas Sephardi, most of it is based on Sephardi, but there's some elements of Ashkenazi mixed into there as well. And here, Chaim Vital did not say this. At least we don't have any writing from Chaim Vital where he said this. But here, Mishnah Chassidim basically allows for a person, a mystic or a non-mystic, to wake up one day and say, you know something? Yeah, maybe it's a Sheres Neshama, but you know something? If I'm not feeling satisfied right now, maybe that itself is a siman that it's not for my Neshama. And so then what do? You go over to that Nusach. And then came the Magid of Mizrich. Because as far as we know, the Baal Shem Tov, at least if you judge by the Baal Shem Tov Siddur, it looks like he davened standard Nusach Ashkenaz, which is a fascinating thing. Came along the Magid, and the Magid introduced, it's really a continuation of the Mishnah Chassidim. The Mishnah Chassidim said that if you're not comfortable, if you're not sure that that's the path for you, then change over. So the Magid came along and gave it a lot more oisius. This idea gave a lot more oisius. What did he explain? So it's a Magid Varav Yaakov Simin Kuf Lamed Gimel. And he basically says, Reb Chaim Vital spoke about 12 gates. Guess what? There's 13 gates. Now how could it be 12 and 13? Because the Nevuah of Yecheskel is talking about gates into the city of Yerushalayim. 4 sides, 3 gates on each side. However, the Mishnah in Shkalim says that to Har Habayis there were 13 gates. Into Har Habayis, not into the city of Yerushalayim, into Har Habayis. So he looks at that. You have 13 gates. 12 we know what they are. What's the 13th? What's the 13th gate into Yerushalayim? So he says the 13th gate going into Yerushalayim is Lemi she'enei zoicher shiftoi ve'enei yedeya be'ezeh shar yaveh lachatzar hamelech. This is for the person who doesn't know his shevet and doesn't know how to reach the king's chamber. Lazeh mechuvan ashar yud gimel. That's what Emmanuel Chayriki was saying. That if you're not really comfortable, then move over to the Arizal's version, to the Reb Chaim Vital's version. So the Maggid is calling that the 13th gate. And he writes that the Arizal, everything was open for him. And he said that whoever doesn't know their shevet, his nusach is for them. So then the Maggid asks the question, hey Bazoi, if that's true, what do you need the first 12 for? Just have the 13th gate. And then everyone could go. If that's the gate that works for everyone, somehow it works for everyone, so what do you need the 13th, what do you need the other 12? So he says, no. If you know which path you're on, then it's better to stick to yours. Somehow that gate is better. The Shara Koilel is only for those who don't know what their gate is. So this is, the way I see it at least, is the Maggid expounding on the idea of the Mishnah Chassidim. And so you end up having Reb Chaim Vital saying, everyone stay where you are. But when you start moving a few decades and centuries later, the Mekubalim open up this idea of, no, there's actually more latitude to change over, and slowly many, many people started changing over. And there's no doubt that the Alter Rebbe held like this, which is what led to the Alter Rebbe actually making the Siddur, the Nusach Siddur Tfilas HaArizal. And so therefore you end up really, is we have three statements. I don't have here a statement of Alter Rebbe, but the truth is, there's a Maimer in Maimorei Aksarim where Alter Rebbe summarizes this idea, mamish from the Maggid, word for word. So you could say that you have three statements from the Alter Rebbe, and then we can try to figure out how they all work together. Statement number one from the Alter Rebbe is Chayim Vital in the Shulchan Aruch. You don't change nothing. Very, very strict, very conservative. Then you have statement number two, Kolim Arshtam. There's no shaila. You can change, no problem. Then you have statement number three, Shar, for those who don't know their Shar, and we're living in a time now where none of us really know our Shar, and so therefore we should all move over to Nusach HaArizal, the Shar Yud Gimel. How to bring all three of these together is something to think about. What's the Hira? So here is very easy, the Hira. First of all, we spoke about Shalom before, which is a very important thing. There's another interesting thing when it comes to the Shvatim, and this will conclude. Because on the one hand, we spoke about the Shar HaKoilo, and the Shar HaKoilo is for everyone. And even Chaim Vital spoke about what's in the Gemara is for everyone. So in other words, one of the themes of the sources we were looking at today is the idea of sameness amongst Jews. However, one of the other themes was the 12 different pathways, the different nuschais, which are al pi Torah, different nuschais. Those are separate pathways. And here we reach an interesting point where for a Jew to be a proper Jew, we need to develop both of these. We need to develop the part of us that is the same, and we need to have a relationship with other Jews out of that element of sameness. But then there's another point. That is, I bring something unique to the table, you bring something different to the table, and specifically because of our differences, that's why we should love each other, because we both contribute to each other. I bring something and you bring something, and so contradictorily, it sounds like a paradox, but it's actually the differences and the uniqueness that makes the shleimus that can be between Yidden. There's beautiful Torah from Chassidus Polish Chassidus, about the Shvatim, that Bilam looked out and he saw the Shvatim dwelling separately, so he praised them. So the Shaila is, what's the Maila? What would be wrong? Have all the Yidden living together. Why did it have to be? They were divided by Shevet. So it says in Sfarim, because every Shevet had their own Avodah. And if you're all living together, then you're not doing unique Avodah, because the way Hashem created us is that we just get influenced by our surroundings. When I know at the end of the day, I may go here or there, at the end of the day, I'm going back to my community, to my Shevet, and I'm living amongst my people, it reminds me, and it develops an attitude and a culture of, what do I stand for? What's my uniqueness, and how can I be better at that? And so that's something for us to think about in our Avodas Hashem, both the achdus that we all share, as well as the uniqueness we all have.